Hi, and welcome to the fourth video in our PowerShell 7.2 for Intermediate tutorial series. In the last couple videos, we've seen a lot on methods and modules. Today, we're going to be taking a look at PowerShell remoting. So this is going to be used to connect to remote computers or remote servers and interact with them. This is going to be very useful to manage your Windows server environment. If you have like domain controllers, Hyper-V machines, or file servers, print servers, all sorts of different servers, you can completely manage them through PowerShell remoting, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. So in this example, I'm actually not using a domain joined computer, but I will be actually interacting with my domain controller. So there's a little bit of extra steps to do it this way because I'm not a domain joined computer. If you have a domain joined computer, there are a few differences that I will actually be going over once we hit those differences in the code. But it's actually easier if the machines are domain joined. You have a little bit less. And in my first version of this tutorial series, in the first remoting video in PowerShell 5.1, I'm actually using a domain joined computer there. So if you actually wanted a more domain joined example, that would be the one to look at. But this one, honestly, is going to be probably better than that one. And I'm going to go over the differences. If anything, it's actually more simple when you're in a domain joined environment. So let's actually go ahead and let's get started on just knowing what a script block is, because we're going to need to know what a script block is in order to actually do PowerShell remoting. So if I actually execute this line of code here that we've seen before to get the computer name, this is simply a variable. I can run it. I get the name of my machine. Now, if I put this into and then what I can do is I can do like a write output, and this is some text here. If we run this commandlet with some text, it executes just fine. But now if I put a variable here called test and I make this equal to write output, and then I look at what test is, we will see that test just looks like this is some text, and that's completely fine. It's just the output of this is some text. But the real thing that I want to pass is the real thing that I want to display with test is I actually want to actually show this command, what I'm executing with test. So what we could actually do here is create a script block. So the way that we would do here is we would create a variable for a test block here, and we would make this equal to an open and close curly bracket. And then we could do a write output. Let's just say this is a script block. Now the curly brackets is what defines it as a script block. So if I actually run this line of code here and I look at what test block is, we will actually see that the test block is actually equal to write output. This is a script block. Now to execute what is actually in that script block, the only thing that we need to do is add an ampersand symbol and a space. And then we have that, and then it actually executes. This is a script block. That's the output of write output. This is a script block. So the ampersand executes what's inside of that script block. This is going to be very useful to know when we're executing remote commands because they are all passed through a parameter of script block. So that is the major reason why we go over that. Now, one other thing that we actually have to do, because this is a non-domain joined computer, so this is again only if you have a non-domain joined computer and you're going to be interacting with other computers that are not on the same domain as you, you will actually have to do this next step. So you're going to want to make sure that your PowerShell remoting is enabled. Now, all of this you will actually have to do in a PowerShell 7 console as administrator. So you want to make sure that you have PowerShell remoting enabled, and that you can actually enable that just by doing enable -ps remoting, and that will turn that on. If you've already followed all the install videos on this channel, when we first installed PowerShell 7, we actually checked the box of enable PowerShell remoting. So that's actually already done for us. The only thing that you need to do is actually set a trusted host so you can interact with the computer that you want to interact with. Because by default, if you're in a non-domain environment and a non-domain joined computer and you try to interact with another computer, it will give you an error saying that the remoting cannot be done because it is not a trusted host. So we need to actually add a trusted host. Now, the way that you would add a trusted host here is actually going to be a set-item and then WSMan : /localhost /client /trusted hosts and then space -value. And then here you're going to put in the computer name and the IP address. So for me, I already have this in here, but it's actually going to be, for me, it's going to be hypv 2016l.jack.ca because that is my domain controller. And then we're going to do a comma, and then you're going to put in the IP address of that computer. So for me, it is 172.30.123.5. So once you actually have that here, you're actually able to also go see it. So let me just erase this here. So if I do a get item now, WSMan localhost client and then trusted host. So here's my hypv 2016l.jack.ca 172.30.123.5. Now, when you're interacting with computers in a non-domain environment, again, you're going to be using the IP address and not really the name. But if you ever get an error message saying that you cannot connect to the remote computer because the WinRM is not configured with the trusted host, this is what it means. You're going to need to do that set item WSMan localhost client trusted host and put in the name and the IP of that machine that you're trying to remote into, and then that will allow you to do so. So that's just a little tidbit here on a non-domain environment. If you're in a domain environment, again, you don't have to do any of that because you'll just be able to connect directly to that computer because the computer will know that you're part of that domain. You are allowed to interact with it, and that's going to be okay. So the first thing that we need to do in order to invoke a PowerShell remoting command is going to be to use a specific commandlet. And that is actually going to be the invoke-command commandlet. And then it will take in a parameter of computer name. Now, once again, for a non-domain environment, we have to use IP addresses. So we're going to do 172.30.123.5. And then what we need to do as well is we need to pass in a credential because I need credentials because I'm in a non-domain computer and I'm going to be interacting with my domain controller. So I need to pass in my domain administrator credentials. So we're going to pass in some credentials here in just a moment. And then the other parameter is going to be the script block. And as we saw up here, to write a script block, it is going to be an open and close curly bracket, and then we could put our code in here. So the first thing we need to do first is right above this is actually create a variable called creds, and we're going to make that equal to get credential. Now, again, if you're already on a domain computer, you might not need to actually pass in credentials if your credentials of the current user that you're on has the rights to access that remote server or that remote computer. If for some reason, let's say you're in an environment where you have a user account, but you also have an administrator account or a privileged access account to access those remote servers, you would probably need to also get the credentials, but pass in the credentials of your domain administrator account or your privileged access account in order for this to work. So that is a key thing. If your credentials do not match from the computer and the remote computer, you will need to pass those in. So if we actually just run that get credentials code here, so it's going to ask me for the username. And in my case, it is going to be jacked_administrator for my domain administrator. And then we're just going to put in the password here. And that just gets saved to the variable. So In our script block, what we're going to do, just to make it very obvious of if it's working, all I want to do is call the end computer name. So it'll give me the computer name of the environment that I'm currently in. And as we know, right now, if I run this locally, we get desktop-ppdctck. So if we actually run this invoke command on that remote computer with the credentials with that script block, we get hype v2016L, which is perfect. That's what we expected it to be because this IP matches to that computer. So that is perfect. And another example that we can actually do here is we can actually just write write-output and then some double quotes. This is running on, and then a variable wrapper. And let's put in that computer name. So if we actually run this here, we will see this is running on hype v2016. But if I actually just copy this line right out here, outside of that invoke command, and we run it, it is running on desktop-ppdctck. Now, another very interesting thing is we can actually, because this is a domain controller that I'm interacting with, we can actually use the AD commandlets. So right now, if I do a get AD user here on my local computer, we will see that doesn't really work. But if I actually do it here, so if I do a get AD user, I'm going to pass in some other parameters here. So filter star, and then the server is going to be jacked.ca. So if we just do that commandlet outside here, we get the error again. But if I actually run it in my invoke command, we actually get tons of our Active Directory users back. So we know for sure that we are interacting with my domain controller. So this is awesome stuff. We've already now connected remotely to that server. We can interact with it. We can do tons of things to it. Now, what happens if we actually want to pass in some sort of variable? So let's create a variable here. We're going to call it some variable, and we're going to make it equal to the string. This is from Jack's desktop. All right, so we have a variable called some variable here, and we want to pass it into the computer that I'm controlling. Maybe this is actually going to be like a piece of software that I want to install, a command or something that I want to check, a service that I want to check. And I have it stored in a variable because I want to check it on all 100 servers or something. So then we could say, and let's just pass it in a variable wrapper here. So some variable. All right, so what do we expect to run here? I'm going to give you guys like a few seconds to think about it. So basically what we have is a variable called some variable. We have a string, and we're doing an invoke command. And in that invoke command, we're doing a write output. This is running on the environment computer name. And then we put the some variable in there. So let's actually go ahead and let's run this. Now the output that we get is actually, this is running on hype v2016L, which we expected. It's running on that remote computer. And then it's blank. So we actually don't see the variable that we passed in. That is because this is running on the remote computer. Some variable does not actually exist on this computer because this is actually all local. If we want to pass in a variable to our remote machine, there are two ways that we can actually do this. So let's go ahead. Let's just copy this invoke command. We're going to do it the two ways so you guys can actually see it. So what we want to do here is invoke-command computer name. And then we have our script block. And then after a script block, what we want to do is we want to add another parameter. And we want to do an argument list. And then in there, we want to pass in some variable. And then when we're calling some variable, instead of calling some variable, we're going to pass in args. And then a open and closing square bracket. And then in here, we're going to put 0. Because the argument list is an array, so you can actually pass in multiple variables. And then the variables determine, the order of your variables also determine which part of the array you're going to be calling. We're just passing 1, so we're calling the first element of the argument list. So if we actually run this here, we will see this is running on hype v2016. and this is from Jack's desktop. So that actually works perfectly great. The other method that we can actually do is in front of some variable, instead of $ some variable, we're going to do a $ using colon some variable. And if we actually run this here, we will actually see that we get the same result. This is running on Hype-V 2016L, and this is from Jack's desktop. And that is because we're using the using keyword, and that we're actually able to pass in our local variable. So this one is definitely a lot easier to kind of read. You don't need to modify so much. Here we're passing an argument list. So here we actually had to change the variable. Here we just had to add the word using. We didn't have to add an argument list or anything like that, but it is completely up to your preference on which way you like to do it. There's definitely, there are benefits and cons to either or. I would say if your work uses one way, I would just stick to that way. This way, at least everyone's code is consistent and a lot easier to read in the future. So now the only thing that we haven't done yet is really get back values. Now, as we saw a little bit earlier, I was able to get the AD users. So how can we get the AD users from that machine and I can interact with it? Because right now, if I let me just copy this over here. Right now, if I do a get AD user and then a filter star and then a server jacked.ca. Right now, if I do this, I get the users back, but I can't do anything with them. And even if I do a users here and I assign that to get AD user, of course, that is running on the remote computer. So when I go to check users, we don't have anything assigned in users. So what we actually need to do if you want to get anything back is actually, if you just get it to display on the screen, what you could do is do a users equals that Invoke-Command and that script block. And then if we actually run this here, or actually I should say users instead of user. So once we actually have that here, and we can actually look inside of users, and we could do like a select name here. So if we run this, so there is my list of users from my Active Directory domain controller. So we can actually get values back. Now, there might be other times where maybe you have a lot of scripts to run or a lot of commands to run on a single computer, and you need to be able to store variables on that remote computer and execute them again. All these different kind of ways would work, but they're definitely not super efficient. This is where persistent sessions definitely come into play, and they are very, very handy for remoting purposes. So the way that we would actually set up a persistent session is if we create a variable here, we're just going to not name it session. And then we're going to make that equal to new-pssession. And once again, we're going to pass in the computer name. So for us, it's just going to be 172.30.123.5. And then our credential, it's just going to be our same credentials as before. So if we actually pass this here, we run this, and we can look at what the session is. So here we have our session. It's a remote machine. We have 172.30.123.5, which is our machine that we want to connect to. Now, there are two ways that we could actually do this. So if you wanted to interact with that computer in like a live PowerShell console, what you could do is actually enter -pssession and then pass in the session and then pass in our variable here. And once we actually put this, you're going to want to pay attention to down here in that console. Right now it says PSC scripts intermediate tutorials for remoting. If we actually run this here and we go into the session, we actually get into 172.30.123.5 PSC users administrator.hype-v 2016L documents. We're actually in that remote computer. So if we actually do an end computer name here, let me just put that in. And there is the name of the computer that we are on. So we can actually do a get AD user, filter star, server, jack.ca. Oops. It would help if I spell the commandlet correctly. If I do the get AD user, so there's all of our users. Again, I am interacting with that computer, which is crazy to think about sometimes, but we are actually in that computer. We could make manipulations to it. Now, of course, this might not be super handy if you're trying to automate the management of that computer. So let's just go ahead and let's just do an exit-pssession. And we're going to see how we can use the persistent sessions in a more automated way. So what we could actually do is use our same invoke command, but instead of passing in a computer name, we can actually pass in a session name, or a session, I should say. So a session, and then we can actually pass in our session variable, and then we could pass in a script block. And let's just put in a simple script block here. Just do end computer name here. So if we actually do this, we get hype v2016L, which is perfect. Like, we're using our session, so that's awesome. But now let's actually go and let's see if we could do test equals testing. So if we actually run this here, we can Invoke-Command. And then what we could do is if we copy this here and we put it back. So again, we're in that same session and we do a write output test. If we actually run this here, we will actually see testing. Now you might be wondering, can't I do that with the computer name here? So let's actually see how that would look like. So let's just take this invoke command here. And again, this is going to be using the computer name and not the session. So we're not going to get those two mixed up here. So let's just copy this line of code. And if we invoke that command, everything works fine. We've seemingly assigned it to test, to $test. And if we go ahead and we run that here, do a write output to test. So if we actually run this, as you can see, nothing happened. But if we just copy this above here into this one, so we set test to testing, and we write the output, we will actually get testing. But if we just do a write output test again, we get nothing. And this is because if you don't use PS sessions, you're not doing a persistent session. What it's doing, it is starting a new PowerShell session on that remote computer, running the commands that you're doing. And then once it's done executing that script block, that session closes. And when you do another invoke command, it then creates a new session when you're doing it with the computer name and credentials. Whereas if we're using a session, that session is staying open and we're invoking that command in that session. And then we could go back to it and interact with the variables that are created in that session. And then we could actually go ahead and we can disconnect from the session. So to disconnect from the session, because you don't want to leave these sessions open, because then you'll just have a bunch of half-opened connections, and that could lead to some slowness or some other issues. So what I like to do is I like to just do a disconnect session -ps session, pass in the session here. And then I also like to do a remove -ps session, and then session. If you ever want to see if you have any open sessions, all you need to do is do a get -ps session. If we actually run this before we do the disconnect and remove, here we can actually see that we have one opened connection. So if we do a disconnect PS session and we get the PS sessions, we can still see that the session is there. It is in a disconnected state. And then all we need to do is remove the PS session. And now it is empty. If you ever want to get rid of all sessions and make sure that everything is disconnected, everything is removed, all you could do is do a get PS session and then pipe that to disconnect PS session and then pipe that to remove dash PS session. And that will disconnect and remove all your PS sessions that you have open. If for some reason you forgot at one point to remove them, that is the easy way to disconnect and close all of them. So I know that this is quite a lot to take in. If you guys have any specific questions for remoting, please let me know in the comments below. What I will also do is I will put in that command that we executed in the administrator PowerShell 7 window. So the set item, WSMan commandlet. I'm going to put that in the description below. I will also put a link to my tutorial video that shows you how to set up a home lab, because you will need 2 computers or at least a VM running on your computer to be able to test remoting properly. Or if you have a work environment that allows you to do so, you can definitely try it on there as well. Just this is more for like a home lab type of scenario. I will put that description, that link in the description down below as well. But please let me know if you guys have any comments or questions on PowerShell remoting. If you guys would like to see more PowerShell remoting, please let me know as well. Be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell to be notified when that next video comes out, and I will see you guys on the next video.